I think I might hold the world record for being the only person to have their house demolished by a homeowners association they didn't even belong to. It's not exactly a Guinness entry you strive for, let me tell you. The whole insane saga started not with a bang, but with a beige envelope tucked under the rusty handle of my grandfather's old mailbox. If you've got a moment, grab a drink, because this story is a wild ride of suburban warfare, breathtaking audacity, and the kind of sweet, methodical justice that keeps me warm at night. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm curious to see how far this tale of HOA madness travels. It all began with a house. Not just any house, but my grandfather's house. He'd built it himself in the late 60s on a 5-acre plot of land that was, at the time, considered the middle of nowhere. It was a sturdy, unassuming brick rancher, nestled among a stand of ancient oak trees he'd refused to cut down. He was a civil engineer, a man who believed in solid foundations and clear property lines, two things that would become ironically central to this whole mess. When he passed away, he left the house and the land to me. I'm a federal investigator, which is a nice way of saying I spend my life untangling very complex knots of white-collar crime. My days are filled with forensic accounting, witness interviews, and mountains of paperwork that would make a normal person's eyes bleed. Because of my job, I lived in a condo in the city, 2 hours away, and my grandfather's property sat vacant while I figured out what to do with it. My plan was to eventually renovate it and move in, trading the concrete jungle for the shade of those oaks. For the first year, everything was quiet. I'd drive out twice a month to mow the lawn, check on the place, and just sort of breathe in the silence. It was my sanctuary. Then, the development started. A company bought the 100 acres of farmland behind my grandfather's property and began constructing a sprawling, soulless subdivision they called the Gables at Serenity Creek, a name that was, in hindsight, a masterclass in irony. Suddenly, my grandfather's 5 acres of quiet solitude were bordered by a sea of identical beige houses with pristine, chemically green lawns. With the houses came the HOA, and with the HOA came its queen, a woman named Barbara Westwood. I first encountered her not in person, but through her signature, a loopy, arrogant scrawl at the bottom of that first letter I found in the mailbox. The letter, printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock with an embossed Gables at Serenity Creek logo, cordially welcomed me to the neighborhood. It then informed me that my initial HOA dues of $600 were past due and a late fee of $50 had been applied. I laughed. It was clearly a mistake, an administrative error from a new, overzealous organization. I wrote a polite, simple letter in return. I explained that my property, parcel number 47B-12, was not and had never been part of the Gables development. I even included a copy of my grandfather's original land grant and the most recent county plat map, which clearly showed my 5 acres as a distinct and separate entity, a small island surrounded by their sea of beige. I mailed it off and didn't think much more of it. I was in the middle of a massive pension fund fraud case that was taking up all my mental bandwidth. Dealing with a misinformed HOA was a minor annoyance, a gnat to be swatted away. 2 weeks later, another cream-colored envelope arrived. This one was less cordial. It informed me that my dues were now further in arrears and that my property was in violation of several covenants. Specifically, my unapproved mailbox, the one my grandfather had set in concrete in 1968, the non-regulation color of my front door, and the overgrown nature of the native oak trees. The fines for these infractions totaled an additional $750. The letter was, again, signed with Barbara Westwood's flamboyant signature. This time, I didn't just laugh, I felt a flicker of irritation. This wasn't just an error anymore, this was willful ignorance. I'm a professional investigator. My entire life revolves around facts, evidence, and procedure. The fact was, my property was not in her HOA. The evidence was in the county records office. The proper procedure was for her to check those records and correct her mistake. I called the number on the letterhead. A woman with a voice that sounded perpetually bored answered. I asked to speak with Barbara Westwood. Mrs. Westwood is the president, the voice said, as if that explained everything. She doesn't take calls. You can address your concerns to the board in writing. I explained, slowly and calmly, that I had already done so. I reiterated that my property was not part of her association. There was a pause, and I could hear the rustling of papers. "We have your parcel listed as part of Phase 2 of the annexation," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The developer filed the paperwork last year. If you have an issue with it, you'll need to attend a board meeting." Annexation? That was impossible. Annexing a property into an HOA requires the consent of the property owner. It requires signed, notarized documents to be filed with the county. I knew for a fact that I had never signed anything. My grandfather certainly hadn't. This had now moved from willful ignorance to something that smelled distinctly fraudulent. I told the woman on the phone, "There has been no annexation. I am the sole owner, and I have not consented to any such action." "Your records are incorrect." Her reply was a prim, "Well, the board's records say otherwise. Your outstanding balance is now $1,400. Payment is due within 30 days, and she hung up. I stood there in my city condo, the phone still pressed to my ear, a cold knot forming in my stomach. This was the moment I realized this wasn't a gnat, it was a hornet, and I had just poked the nest. I knew I couldn't ignore this. My job had taught me that small-time tyrants, whether in a corporate boardroom or a suburban HOA, thrive on the inaction of others. They count on you being too busy, too intimidated, or too tired to fight back. I was busy, yes, but intimidated I was not. I hung up the phone and opened my laptop. It was time to stop being a polite homeowner and start being an investigator. My first stop was the county registrar's website. I pulled up all the records for my parcel and all adjacent parcels belonging to the Gables. As expected, my land was clearly and legally separate. There were no recent filings, no amendments, and certainly no record of an annexation. So, the Phase 2 annexation the woman on the phone had mentioned was a complete fabrication, a fiction created within the bubble of their own little kingdom. I then started digging into the HOA itself. I found their articles of incorporation, their bylaws, and the names of the board members. At the top of the list, of course, was Barbara Westwood, president. Her husband, a local luxury car dealer named Gary Westwood, was the treasurer. How convenient. This was no longer just about a mistaken property line. It was about a woman who had, for reasons I couldn't yet fathom, decided she wanted my land to be part of her domain, and she was willing to invent a legal reality to make it so. I drafted a second letter, this time far more formal. It was sent via certified mail, return receipt requested. It cited the specific state statutes regarding property rights and HOAs, included notarized copies of my deed and the official county maps, and stated in no uncertain terms that any further contact, harassment, or attempts to levy fines would be met with legal action. It was a cease and desist, plain and simple. I thought, naively, that this would be the end of it. A clear, legal warning shot across the bow should be enough to make any reasonable person stand down. But I was quickly learning that I wasn't dealing with a reasonable person. I was dealing with Queen Barbara, and she was just getting started. A week after I sent the certified letter, the receipt came back signed by Barbara Westwood herself. For a month, there was silence. I thought, perhaps, my legal broadside had finally worked. I got consumed by my federal case, which involved tracing stolen retirement funds through a labyrinth of offshore accounts. It was complex, draining work, and the HOA nonsense faded into the background. It was during a trip to the property for my routine check-in that I realized my optimism had been tragically misplaced. As I pulled up to the house, I saw him, an older gentleman standing near my property line, looking at one of my grandfather's oak trees with a pair of binoculars. He was meticulously dressed, with a crisp collared shirt and neatly pressed trousers. He looked less like a threat and more like a birdwatcher. I got out of my car and gave a friendly wave. "Can I help you?" I asked. He lowered his binoculars and gave me a weary but kind smile. "You must be Arthur's grandson," he said, his voice soft. "I'm George Henderson. I live 2 houses down, in the Gables. Knew your grandfather a bit. Good man." We shook hands. "It's a shame what they're trying to do," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the sea of beige houses. "Who's they?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "Barbara Westwood," he said, the name leaving a sour taste in his mouth. She's got it in her head that this property is part of her kingdom. I was on the architectural review committee for a few months. A real nightmare. I resigned. George, it turned out, was a retired land surveyor. He was one of the few original residents of the area who had been absorbed into the Gables development. They offered us a buyout, but my wife and I are too old to move, he explained. So we're stuck. I've seen the plat map, son. I've seen your deed. You're not in the HOA, but that woman, she doesn't care about facts. She cares about control. And she wants that big oak tree gone. He pointed with his binoculars. It blocks the evening sun from her new rose garden. She's mentioned it at 3 different board meetings. This was a revelation. It wasn't just about a neat, orderly subdivision. It was petty, personal, and vindictive. It was about a tree. She can't do anything, I said, with more confidence than I felt. I sent her a cease and desist. George Henderson sighed, a long, mournful sound. Son, I hope you're right. But let me give you a piece of advice. This woman, Barbara, she cornered the market on audacity. Her husband's a shark of a car salesman, and she's the HOA equivalent. They play dirty. I heard her talking to the other board members, the sycophants, about putting a lien on your place. A lien, a legal claim against a property for unpaid debts. A fraudulent lien, based on fabricated dues and fines, was a serious matter. It could cloud the title and make it impossible to sell or refinance. It was a legal cudgel used to beat homeowners into submission. She can't, I stated flatly. A judge would throw it out in a second. It's baseless. Of course it is, George agreed. But getting in front of a judge takes time and money. Her strategy is to make it so expensive and so frustrating for you to fight that you just give up. She thinks you'll get tired of the battle and sell the land to her cheap. She's already got a developer friend who wants to put up a couple of those McMansions right here. He patted the no trespassing sign I had installed a few months prior. Keep these up. And I'd recommend a camera. A good one. The conversation with George was a splash of cold water. He was my first ally, a voice of reason from inside the belly of the beast. His warning galvanized me. This wasn't a game. Barbara Westwood wasn't just a power-tripping HOA president. She was a predator, and my inheritance was her target. I followed George's advice immediately. I spent the rest of the day installing a high-resolution, motion-activated security camera system that covered the entire perimeter of my property, with feeds going directly to my phone and a cloud server. It felt like an extreme measure, but something told me it was necessary. The next salvo from the HOA arrived a month later. It was a thick packet, again via certified mail. It was a formal notice of lien. They had actually done it. They had hired a notoriously sleazy law firm known for representing aggressive HOAs and had filed a lien against my grandfather's house for the grand total of $2,850 in unpaid dues, fines, and legal fees. The document was filled with legal jargon, but the message was clear: pay us or we will take further action, up to and including foreclosure. The sheer unmitigated gall was stunning. They were threatening to foreclose on a house they had no claim to, for a debt I did not owe. I called my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who had helped me with the paperwork when I inherited the property. I forwarded her the documents, and her reaction was a mix of professional outrage and dark amusement. "This is the most brazenly fraudulent lien I've seen in a decade," she said. "It's legally baseless. We'll file a motion to have it expunged, and we'll sue them for slander of title." The legal process began, but as George had warned, it was slow. We filed our motions. Their lawyer filed counter-motions and requests for discovery. It was a war of attrition designed to bleed me dry. Meanwhile, my federal case reached a critical stage, requiring me to travel out of the country for 2 weeks for a series of high-stakes depositions. I left feeling uneasy, but I trusted the legal process was in motion. I had the cameras running, my lawyer was on the case, and the no trespassing signs were clearly posted. Surely, even Barbara Westwood wouldn't be foolish enough to escalate things further while a lawsuit was pending. That was my second major miscalculation. The hornet's nest was not just poked, it was about to be set on fire, and my house was right in the middle of it. The first inkling that something was catastrophically wrong came via a text message from George Henderson. I was in a hotel room in Geneva, Switzerland, preparing for the next day's deposition. My phone buzzed. The message was simple and terrifying. "They're here, at your house, with a bulldozer." My blood ran cold. I fumbled to open the live feed from my security cameras. The image that loaded onto my screen was surreal, a waking nightmare. There, parked on my front lawn, was a massive yellow bulldozer. A crew of men in hard hats was walking the perimeter of my grandfather's house, and standing there, pointing and directing them with an air of smug authority, was Barbara Westwood. She was wearing a crisp white pantsuit, looking utterly out of place and yet completely in her element. I watched in horror as one of the men started attaching a heavy chain to the corner of the porch. My hands were shaking. I immediately called the local sheriff's department. I explained who I was, where the property was, and that an illegal demolition was in progress. The dispatcher sounded confused. "Sir, are you sure? We haven't received any calls." "I am watching it on a live security camera feed from Switzerland." I nearly shouted. "They are about to pull down my house. The property is not in their HOA. There is a pending lawsuit." The urgency in my voice must have cut through. The dispatcher promised to send a car immediately. Next, I called my lawyer, Sarah. It was the middle of the night for her, but she answered on the second ring. I explained the situation, my voice tight with a mixture of rage and panic. "They can't do that," she exclaimed, suddenly wide awake. "They don't have a demolition order. They don't have a court judgment. That's criminal destruction of property." "I'm on my way there now." I hung up and went back to the camera feed, feeling utterly helpless, an unwilling spectator to the destruction of my own home from 4,000 miles away. I saw the bulldozer engine roar to life, belching a cloud of black smoke into the air, right next to the oak tree Barbara hated so much. I watched, my heart pounding in my throat as the chain tightened. The wooden porch post splintered with a sickening crackle that I couldn't hear but could vividly imagine. Then, the whole porch roof groaned and ripped away from the brick facade, collapsing into a pile of lumber and shingles. Barbara Westwood clapped her hands together, a single, sharp sound of triumph that the camera's microphone picked up clearly. She then turned to the bulldozer operator and pointed at the main house. This wasn't just about a tree anymore. This was a scorched earth campaign. This was her planting a flag on conquered territory. That was the moment something inside me snapped. The panic and helplessness were burned away by a cold, quiet rage. It was the same feeling I got when I was closing in on a particularly loathsome financial criminal, a complete, all-consuming focus. The fight was no longer about stopping them. It was too late for that. My grandfather's house was coming down. The fight was now about what came next. It was about ensuring that every single person responsible for this would face a reckoning so thorough, so methodical, and so devastating that they would regret the day they ever heard my name. I watched for another 10 minutes as the bulldozer smashed through the front wall of the house. The living room where my grandmother used to read to me was exposed, then obliterated. It was like watching a memory being murdered. I took a deep breath, closed the laptop, and started making a list. My professional training kicked in, pushing the emotion aside and replacing it with process. I was no longer just a wronged homeowner. I was the lead investigator on a new case, the People versus Barbara Westwood, and I would be the prosecution, the judge, and the jury. The deposition in Geneva could wait. I booked the first flight back home. The war had begun. By the time my flight landed at the state's main airport and I made the 2-hour drive, it was all over. Where my grandfather's sturdy brick house had stood for over 50 years, there was now just a pile of rubble. The bulldozer was gone. The crew was gone. The only thing remaining was a large, professionally printed sign hammered into the dirt. It read, "Future site of the Gables Estates, an exclusive community by the Gables at Serenity Creek, OA." They hadn't just demolished my home, they had claimed the land and advertised their victory. The sheer arrogance was breathtaking. The sheriff's deputies had arrived, of course, but it had been too late. Barbara had shown them a sheaf of papers, a supposed court order authorizing the demolition to abate a public nuisance. The deputies, not being experts in civil court filings, had been hesitant to intervene in what looked like a legitimate, if aggressive, HOA action. They had told the crew to stop, pending verification, but by then the bulk of the damage was done. My lawyer, Sarah, was there to meet me, her face a mask of cold fury. She was standing by the pile of bricks that used to be a fireplace, holding a copy of the court order Barbara had shown the police. "It's a fake," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "A complete and utter forgery. The case number is fake. The judge's signature is forged. The court seal is a low-quality photocopy. I've already spoken with the court clerk. No such order was ever issued." This was the smoking gun. This elevated the situation from a monstrous civil tort to a series of serious felonies. Forgery, filing a false document, perjury. Barbara Westwood hadn't just bent the rules, she had committed blatant, prosecutable crimes to get what she wanted. "All right," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Here's what we're going to do." Sarah and I stood there, amidst the ruins of my family history, and we mapped out the counteroffensive. It would be a two-pronged attack, civil and criminal. The civil suit would be massive. We would sue the HOA, Barbara Westwood personally, her husband Gary as the treasurer who undoubtedly authorized the funds for this travesty, every single board member who voted for it, and the demolition company that had acted with such reckless negligence. We would sue for the replacement value of the home, the value of the land, punitive damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. We would aim for a number so high it would make their eyes water. But that wasn't enough. A civil judgment was just about money. I wanted accountability. I wanted justice. That meant the criminal prong was my personal project. I told Sarah to handle the civil side. I would handle the rest. I was now on bereavement leave from work, which they had graciously granted when I told them my family home had been destroyed. This gave me time. All the time I needed. I went home to my condo, showered, and put on what I privately called my work uniform, a simple, dark suit. I wasn't going to be a grieving grandson anymore. I was going to be an investigator. My first stop was not the police department. It was back to the scene of the crime. I spent hours carefully walking the perimeter, taking hundreds of photographs. I documented the tire tracks from the bulldozer. I found footprints. I collected the sign they had posted, bagging it as evidence. I then went to see George Henderson. He was distraught. I called as soon as I saw them. He said, his voice heavy with guilt, "I'm so sorry, son. I feel like I should have done more." "George," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You did more than anyone. You were my early warning system. Now, I need your help. I need to know everything you know about Barbara, her husband, and this developer she's been talking to." George's eyes lit up with a grim sense of purpose. He invited me in, and for the next 3 hours, he was my confidential informant. He told me the developer's name, a man named Richard Slade, a notoriously cutthroat local builder with a reputation for paving over anything that stood in his way. He told me about the HOA's finances, how Gary Westwood ran the treasury like his own private bank account, using HOA funds for lavish community events that were mostly just parties for him and his friends. He gave me the names of the other 2 board members, a timid couple named the Martins, who George described as Barbara's loyal lapdogs. With this information, my investigation began in earnest. I started by running a full background check on Barbara, Gary, and Richard Slade. I used the same professional databases I used for my federal cases. I pulled their financial histories, corporate filings, and property records. A picture began to emerge. Barbara wasn't just a power-hungry suburbanite. She was deeply in debt. Her husband's car dealership was struggling, and they had recently taken out a second mortgage on their own home. Richard Slade, the developer, had recently secured zoning approval for a new high-density townhouse project, contingent on him acquiring a large enough parcel of land. My 5 acres, combined with the adjacent HOA common area, was the perfect size. Suddenly, the motive was crystal clear. It wasn't about a tree or an ugly mailbox. It was about a secret, off-the-books deal between the Westwoods and Slade. Slade would pay the Westwoods a handsome consulting fee under the table for delivering the combined properties. The demolition of my house was to scare me into a quick, cheap sale of the land. If I didn't sell, they would use the fraudulent lien to try and foreclose. It was a criminal conspiracy hiding in plain sight, disguised as a petty HOA dispute. The next step was to talk to the demolition company. I found their address in an industrial park on the other side of town. The owner, a beefy man named Frank, was initially hostile when I walked into his office. "Look," I told the cops, "we had a court order." "It's not my problem. It is your problem, Frank," I said, my voice low and even. I slid a copy of the forged order across his desk, next to a copy of a real court order I had printed from a public database. "This is what you had, and this is what a real one looks like. Notice the difference in the seal, the font, the judge's signature. The one you have is a bad fake. A very, very bad fake." Frank's blustering demeanor evaporated. His face went pale as he looked back and forth between the two documents. "I'm a federal investigator," I said, letting the words hang in the air. I didn't show him my badge yet. "That was for later. Right now, this is a civil matter. My lawyer is naming you and your company in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for wrongful demolition. Your insurance will drop you, your bond will be revoked, and you will be out of business. However, your cooperation could be beneficial." Frank started sweating. "She showed me the papers," he stammered. "The HOA president, Mrs. Westwood. She said it was all legal. She paid half up front, in cash." Cash. Another piece of the puzzle. I slid a non-disclosure agreement and a blank affidavit across the desk. "Tell me everything, Frank. Tell me about the cash. Tell me about every conversation you had with Barbara Westwood. Write it all down. Get it notarized, and you will become a material witness for the prosecution instead of a defendant." He started talking. And I started writing. The net was closing. With Frank's sworn affidavit in my evidence file, I had a direct link between Barbara and the criminal act. But I still needed to connect her to the developer, Richard Slade, and prove the financial motive. This required a different kind of approach. I knew from George that the HOA board meetings were held on the first Tuesday of every month in the community clubhouse. The next one was in 6 days. The Gables at Serenity Creek HOA bylaws, which I had downloaded and read cover to cover, had a provision allowing any affected property owner to be placed on the agenda with 48 hours' notice. Given that my property was currently a pile of rubble due to their actions, I figured I qualified. I submitted a formal request to be added to the agenda. My topic was listed simply as, "To discuss the resolution of Parcel 47, B-12. I knew Barbara would see this as an act of desperation. She would assume I was coming, hat in hand, to either beg for a settlement or to yell impotently. She would be smug, prepared, and surrounded by her enablers. It was the perfect stage for what I had planned. In the days leading up to the meeting, I worked tirelessly. Sarah, my lawyer, filed the civil suit. The summonses were delivered to Barbara and Gary at their home, to the Martins, and to Frank's demolition company. The lawsuit was for $10 million. I wanted them to be panicked and off balance when I walked into that meeting. The amount was intentionally high, designed to cause maximum psychological shock. Meanwhile, I was piecing together the financial trail. Using the information from Frank, I knew the demolition had cost $30,000. Barbara had paid him $15,000 in cash up front. Where did a woman with a second mortgage get that kind of cash? Her husband's car dealership. I paid a visit to the dealership, not as an investigator, but as a potential customer. I walked the lot, asked a few questions, and while the salesman was distracted, I observed the office dynamics. Gary Westwood was there, a man with a cheap suit and an expensive watch, barking orders. I saw the kind of daily cash transactions that happen at a used car lot. It wouldn't be hard for him to skim $15,000 from the books. Proving it would be harder, but I had enough circumstantial evidence to paint a very compelling picture. My final piece of preparation was a phone call to an old colleague in the local district attorney's office. I laid out the whole case for him: the fraudulent lien, the forged court order, Frank's affidavit, the suspected conspiracy with the developer. He was floored. "This is one of the most brazen things I've ever heard," he said. "Are you sure you don't want us to just go and arrest her now?" "No," I said. "I have a plan. I want her to be publicly exposed before she's arrested. I want her entire kingdom to watch her fall. But I would appreciate it if you could have a couple of uniformed officers available to be dispatched to the Gables clubhouse at 8 p.m. on Tuesday, just in case." He agreed without hesitation. The stage was set. I had my evidence organized in a crisp leather briefcase. I had a projector and a laptop, ready to display the forged documents, the real documents, and damning quotes from Frank's affidavit. I had George Henderson, who had agreed to attend as a witness to Barbara's long-standing obsession with the property. I had the civil suit hanging over their heads like the sword of Damocles. And I had 2 police cars waiting for my signal. The night of the meeting arrived. I put on my investigator suit. I felt calm, focused, and filled with a righteous, icy anger. As I drove towards the gables at Serenity Creek, I thought about my grandfather. He was a man of order, of rules, of things being done the right way. What Barbara Westwood had done was an affront to everything he stood for. This wasn't just revenge for my house. It was about restoring order. It was about proving that foundations, both of houses and of laws, matter. When I walked into that clubhouse, the air crackled with tension. About 30 residents were seated in folding chairs. At the front, at a long table, sat Queen Barbara, flanked by her husband Gary and the timid Martin couple. She saw me walk in, and a smirk flickered across her face. It was the smirk of a predator who thinks her prey has walked right into the trap. She had no idea that I was the one who had set it. Barbara Westwood called the meeting to order, her voice oozing a sickly sweet condescension. She ran through the agenda treasurer's report, landscaping committee update with an air of bored importance. Gary Westwood gave a mumbled report about finances, conveniently omitting the $15,000 cash withdrawal for the demolition. Then she got to my item. And finally, she announced, her eyes locking with mine, we have a visitor, Mr. Davies, who wishes to discuss the successful abatement of the derelict property on parcel 47B-12. Successful abatement, the language of a tyrant. A few residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The news of the demolition and the $10 million lawsuit had clearly spread. Mr. Davies, she said, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. You have 5 minutes. She gestured to the single, sad-looking microphone in the middle of the room. I didn't go to the microphone. Instead, I walked to the front of the room and began setting up my projector. I won't need the microphone, Barbara, I said, using her first name, and I'll need more than 5 minutes. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Gary Westwood started to stand up. Now, see here, you can't just. Sit down, Gary, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. He froze, then slowly sank back into his chair, looking confused. Barbara's smirk tightened. You are not in a position to make demands. You are here at the board's courtesy. No, I said, plugging in my laptop. I'm here as the victim of a coordinated criminal enterprise that you orchestrated. And you are all going to listen to what I have to say. I projected the first image onto the screen behind them. It was a beautiful photograph of my grandfather's house, taken the previous summer, nestled among the oaks. This was my home, I said, my voice resonating in the silent room. Built by my grandfather, a home that some of you knew, a home that was not, and has never been, a part of your HOA. I then projected the county plat map, the red line clearly delineating my property. This is the legal reality. Next, I projected a copy of the first letter they sent me. And this is the beginning of the fiction you created. A fiction of unpaid dues for an association I don't belong to. I went through the entire history, step by step. The letters, the fines from my grandfather's mailbox, the Phase 2 annexation lie. With each slide, the mood in the room grew heavier. The residents were leaning forward, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. Barbara's face had gone from smug to stony. Then, I put up the forged court order. To achieve her goal, Mrs. Westwood did not turn to the law. She broke it. This is the document she gave to the demolition company and the sheriff's deputies. It's a forgery. Beside it, I projected a real court order. As you can see, the seals don't match. The case numbers are fabricated. The signature of Judge Franklin is a clumsy fake. A gasp went through the room. George Henderson, sitting in the front row, nodded grimly. And how did she pay for this criminal act? I continued, looking directly at Gary Westwood, whose face was now ashen. She paid the demolition company with $15,000 in cash. Cash that is unaccounted for in the treasurer's report you just gave, Gary. Gary looked like he was about to be sick. The Martins were visibly shrinking in their chairs, trying to become invisible. But I was focused on Barbara. She stood up, her face a mask of fury. "This is slander. These are outrageous lies. You are trespassing, and I am ordering you to leave this property immediately. Security." Two hapless-looking security guards hired for the meeting started to walk towards me. "Don't," I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm. I reached into my jacket, and for the first time, I pulled out my credentials. I flipped open the leather wallet and held it up for them, and then for Barbara to see. The golden badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the clubhouse. "I am a federal investigator with the United States Department of Labor," I announced, my voice filling the now deathly silent room. "While my usual work involves pension fraud, I am also a sworn federal law enforcement officer, and what I have uncovered here is not slander, it's a litany of state and federal crimes. Mail fraud, for sending fraudulent demands for payment through the Postal Service. Wire fraud, for communications with the demolition company. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Forgery, perjury. And that's just the appetizer." This was the moment. This was the scene I had replayed in my mind 100 times. Barbara Westwood froze. Her mouth, which had been open to shout at me, hung slack. Her eyes were wide, fixed on my badge. The color drained from her face, leaving a pasty, sickly gray. The arrogant, powerful HOA queen vanished, replaced by a common criminal who had just been caught. The smirk, the condescension, the power, it all evaporated in an instant. She just stood there, paralyzed, as the weight of what was happening finally crushed her. "You see, Barbara," I said, slowly walking towards her. "You thought I was just some guy with an old house you could bully. You underestimated me. You assumed I would be too weak, too poor, or too stupid to fight back. But you didn't just demolish a house, you committed federal crimes to do it, and you did it to a man who puts people like you in prison for a living." I looked past her to the terrified residents. "Your HOA is bankrupt. My civil suit will see to that. Your insurance will not cover deliberate criminal acts. Which means every one of you who stood by and let this happen may be on the hook personally." Panic erupted. The room exploded in a cacophony of angry, frightened shouts, all directed at the board. I turned back to Barbara, who was still frozen, her eyes wide with terror. "You have the right to remain silent," I said, my voice low and clear. "I suggest you use it." As if on cue, the double doors of the clubhouse swung open. Two uniformed police officers walked in, their presence silencing the room instantly. I had made the call just as I was setting up my projector. They walked calmly to the front of the room. I simply nodded towards Barbara, Gary, and the Martins. The reign of Queen Barbara was officially over. The rest was a blur of righteous satisfaction. Barbara, Gary, and the Martins were arrested on the spot. Richard Slade, the developer, was arrested the next day, implicated by the financial records we uncovered on Gary's computer. The HOA collapsed into receivership. My civil suit was a slam dunk. Facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, the HOA's insurance carrier, after much legal wrangling, settled for a sum that was more than enough to cover the full replacement cost of the house, punitive damages, and all legal fees. I used the money to rebuild. I hired the best architect I could find, and we designed a new house on the exact footprint of the old one. It's modern, beautiful, and energy efficient, but it has the same spirit, the same solid foundation, and, of course, a state-of-the-art security system. The Gables at Serenity Creek is run by a new board now, headed by my friend, George Henderson. They are reasonable, fair, and they keep meticulous records. The sign advertising their Gables estates is now a piece of evidence in a sealed box somewhere. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on my new porch looking out at the ancient oak trees that started it all, I think about Barbara Westwood. She was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Her belief that she was above the law, that her petty desires trumped my fundamental rights, was her undoing. She built her kingdom on a foundation of arrogance and intimidation, and it crumbled to dust the moment someone, with a solid foundation of their own, decided to stand up and push back. And that, my friends, is a lesson worth more than any house.